Okay, the FundRef is FundRef is the final extra CrossRef service that we're going to discuss here. And FundRef came about because universities, governments, commercial, non-commercial funding organizations pay a lot of money for research, and there's a lot of publications that come out of their funded research, and they're very concerned that they can't easily identify the publications that have emerged from their funded research. And this is because publishers put funding information in lots of different places, and even if they do embed it within XML, it's tagged quite differently. So it's very difficult to easily find out who funded a particular piece of research. And as an example, I mean, this article, it's in the acknowledgements. In this article, there's a funding line provided at the end of the abstract. In this article, this is also in the acknowledgements. And in this article, although the work is there and this is tagged within the XML file, it's not tagged as funding information, it's just tagged as a footnote. So again, even from a programmatic point of view, it'd be very difficult to find this information. And there's also the problem that even when publishers do encode and tag funding information, they use different tags because there is no consistency within it. So this publisher uses grant sponsor for the funder name and grant-NUM for the grant number, whereas another publisher might use funder and funding program. So it's quite difficult if people are using lots of different systems. It means that a university or a funding organization could not easily interrogate the metadata and find out who has funded what outcomes. There's also problems in that different funding organizations are given different acronyms by publishers. So National Institutes of Health may be called NIH and may be called NIH with full points. Now, a human being knows that these are the same, but a machine does not. And so if you're interrogating a lot of data using text or data mining that we mentioned earlier, or some automated system of finding articles, you couldn't find where there's a misspelling or where things have been represented differently. And of course, some authors may even translate them into their local language, which causes extra complexities. And the reason this matters is because universities and grant funding bodies want to know what publications have come out of their funding. And they want to easily link to that content, and sometimes they want to be able to collect that content so that they can prove and justify their expenditure into research through the outcomes of that research. So the CrossRef solution that has come up with is FundRef, and this is a linking system to link the publishers and the outcome of their research with the funders, and so they can record where they easily spend their money. Now, where it came from, this also is quite a new project. It started as a pilot in 2012 and got the go-ahead in 2013, supported, as you could see, by a lot of big publishers and some of the very big funders as well, like the American Science Foundation and the Wellcome Trust. How to implement this properly, FundRef said you've got to have a formal taxonomy of all the funding bodies. And what they did was they made an agreement with Elsevier, who retain a list of these funders. It's been donated by Elsevier, and it includes nearly 9,000 names. It's updated monthly because people are constantly finding new funders. And this is a list that is freely available for anybody to use to find out who the grant funders are. The numbers of the projects, of course, there's too many to track, so these have to be free text. But having an agreed taxonomy for the funder names, that's the first step in making sure that things are presented in a form that a machine can interrogate and identify. And how it works is that CrossRef have added this to the optional metadata, so that the funding and the grant number information is included within the article metadata, which is then submitted to CrossRef with the DOI. This all starts with the FundRef Registry, and at this point, Rachel, could I pass over to you? So, you'll notice as soon as things get tricky, I pass over to Rachel. Cool.
Yeah, so as Pippa was saying, we start with the FundRef Registry, so that list of funders. And how that works is the publisher can use that FundRef Registry within their submission system, and they can collect, so they can search from that list to get the definitive funder name, and then they can also collect the grant number at that point as well. Whenever they're collecting that information in the submission systems, it means that they can then pass it on to their production systems, that's the point at which the information gets passed to CrossRef with the article metadata and with the DOI. So we collect that within a specific format so that a machine can tell what it is. Now that we've got that information, it means that it can be looked at, it can be queried by funders, by researchers, institutions and publishers, and I'll show you some ways in which they can do that later in the presentation. But we really think it's valuable to be able to link up the DOI with the award number, with the funding source, because then it means that one thing is discoverable via the other things. So if you match that in with other information like ORCID IDs, it just gives more ways to be able to discover that information and to link it back to the publication. So said it could be linked with ORCID as well. So pulling together definitively the author, the DOI, or what they published, with the funding that they received in order to do that, which is becoming increasingly valuable as funders want to see what the results of their funding actually are. Just to sidetrack into ORCID a little bit, for those of you who may not have heard of it, basically it's an author identifier provided by ORCID. ORCID are nothing to do with CrossRef, they're a separate organisation, but they're a non-profit of funders, publishers and associations that give unique identification for authors, and it gives them an ORCID ID number, which distinguishes them from anyone else with a similar name and their publications. So, for example, some researchers will say, well, there aren't very many people with my name, I think it's fine. But actually, I think in places like Korea, there are only 6 common surnames, so you can understand why it's incredibly useful to be able to distinguish which author is listed on a paper, so that, again, so that they can get credit for it, and so that they can prove that they've done the correct thing in terms of the publication policy of their funders, for example. And that's another thing that publishers can deposit at CrossRef. Along with the author information, they can deposit the ORCID ID as well. And we're looking at ways that we can then automatically push that information, so publication information, into the author's ORCID records. So this is just the ORCID homepage. You can have a look. If you'd like your own ORCID, it's free and it takes just a couple of minutes to register for that. So there are over, I think, nearly 2 million ORCIDs have been assigned to researchers as of this date, and more submission systems and publishers, and also sort of academic sort of university management systems are using the ORCID ID and some funders are actually starting to require it, so requiring that whenever authors submit information that's been funded or a paper that's been funded by them, that they provide the ORCID ID as well. So I think the Wellcome Trust in the UK has mandated that, so that's going to be incredibly valuable. So this is just a quick ORCID profile. So you can see that this is something that can follow a researcher round between organisations. So if you move to a different university, then your ORCID record stays with you. You've got your biography and a list of all of the articles that you've published, and you can also see funding information reflected in that as well. So you can see who's Pippa's received no funding that she is declaring at this point. So, as I said, authors can provide the information during the submission process, and some publishers will also add the information after acceptance by doing analysis of the article. It's obviously important that publishers that they try to control the quality of that and make sure that what the author has entered is sensible and that it reflects the database. One thing that we have to do, because the database is still growing, is we have to put a field that says other, because we're conscious that we've got nearly 9,000 funders in the registry, but I'm sure there are lots more. So sometimes people use the other option and enter somebody in free text that's actually in the database. So that's the kind of things that publishers can check on, and they can make sure that the funder name matches up to the funder ID that we have in the system, because that becomes important later on in the process for that information to be discovered. So, as I said, hence making sure the instructions for authors are really clear. If you've worked in journals or in editorial offices, you'll know that authors can enter lots of weird and wonderful things. So the clearer the instructions, the better. And also to make sure that it matches any acknowledgements or that the author has actually put in the body of the manuscript itself. A lot of the, again, manuscript submission systems have integrated FundRef, and we're working with, to your earlier point, we're working with OJS so that they can do it sort of an official plug-in as well, because we wanted them to do it later last year, but because they have to change their submission workflow to integrate that step, it's taking a bit longer, but I think we're nearly there. But you can add, we've created a specific, again, a widget that a publisher could add into their own submission pages, just as a quick route in case they have their own submission system. And again, what it does is it references the official registry of funder names, so that if you've got your own submission system, you don't need to build a bespoke product for it. You can just plug this in. Publishers are manually extracting, so if it's at the end of the process, publishers are manually extracting information from the article it says and then matching it to the registry. Obviously, that's more work for the publisher rather than just verifying what the author has put in. So if you can get it on submission and get authors used to the idea that this is something that they're going to be asked for, then great. And I know that institutions are doing more work with researchers to make sure that they know how to reference and how to reference any funding that they've received from an institution. For publishers who might have, and publishers had been collecting funding information on their papers in the past, especially for NIH deposits where there were specific guidelines as to how the paper should be published and when it should be archived and things like PubMed, etc. So the publisher that I used to work with, we used to keep a spreadsheet of that kind of information. One thing that we tried that the labs team has been working on, so our kind of programmers, is that we built a little reconciliation service. So if publishers have a list of funders related to articles, they can use this little service to try to match those funders up with people in the database in order to be able to deposit them. But once you have the funder information, then publishers can make sure that that goes into the article metadata before it gets deposited to CrossRef. For those of you who are interested, in the same way that Crossmark is a little additional snippet of extra metadata, this is the FundRef part. So you can see that it has a specific program, which means that we can require the information to come to us in a specific way, so we can make sure that we're taking in like the best information. Each funder name in the registry has a funder identifier, which again means that they can be separated out from other funders who might have similar names. Or to talk to the example about the National Science Foundation, it might be the National Science Foundation of Korea, National Science Foundation of Lithuania, and you need to be able to distinguish those individual funders to be able to disambiguate the data. What do we do with the information when we have it? How can funders go in and check? So Pippa showed the CrossRef Metadata Search earlier, and we've actually built a specific FundRef search, and anyone can use this to go in and to look at how many articles or pieces of content in the CrossRef database are funded by a specific source. So you can just put the funder name in, and you can see that it tries to do a bit of autofill to try to suggest potential funders. If you're interested, the funder who we have the most records for at the moment is the National Science Foundation of China. So you can see that they're definitely a growing influence in the industry. When I put that in, then I can see the articles that CrossRef can see have been funded by that organisation. So that's a really quick way to look it up. And there's also the option to download that information as a CSV file if you do want it in a format where you can edit it and you can report on it, etc. And you can also, we've also provided some filter options down the left. Because that's looking at the CrossRef metadata, that kind of information is also available just within the standard CrossRef metadata search. So enter a grant number. If that's been provided, then you can find the article associated with that grant number. And again, if we have funding information that's been given to us by a publisher, then we'll display that underneath the title and the author information from the article. You can search for a DOI and find that information, or you can search for an ORCID ID and you can find the articles within CrossRef that have been written by a specific author that has the ORCID ID. As a quick side note, you can log into ORCID via CrossRef Metadata Search and just choose and just automatically add things that you've published to your ORCID record without having to do the two things separately. To participate, again, anyone can use FundRef who's a CrossRef member. There's no this is a free one. There's no charge, and it just comes in as part of the DOI deposit. We're not in the habit of charging people for depositing extra metadata, but sometimes we need to support services or products that go over and above just the metadata. This one is predominantly the metadata, so we don't charge for it. There are a couple of people, and this is really, we've had a lot more engagement from funders who aren't CrossRef members necessarily, but they'd be more interested because they can start using the search and lookup tools to identify the articles that they funded. Publishers can start implementing the deposit information, and they can also then track. They can then track this more effectively. And anyone else, you can just look if you're interested and see where the funding's coming from. That's a quick run through FundRef. Ginny's going to wrap up in a second, but if anyone has quick questions before we go.